night that refused to turn dark over a piece of Soviet territory should have been a myth, not a file. Yet the folder in front of me says it plainly enough. Zone North. Incident of anomalous nocturnal illumination. Restricted distribution. Someone has added a second title in pencil, pressed hard into the cardboard as if the words themselves were unwelcome. The Soviet night that would not go out. According to the official abstract, a remote lab once monitored a fading signal recorded during a night that appeared unnaturally bright to a select group of observers. An anomaly surfaced in their visual reports, followed by unusual reactions in the light-sensing equipment. Moments later, a shift in the final readings was quietly acknowledged by the KGB unit responsible for the region and then buried under more comfortable paperwork. It sounds clinical when you phrase it that way. It always does. The shorthand strips out the thing people remember later, which in this case is simple and hard to live with. Some were convinced that, on certain nights, darkness itself stepped back from a patch of the world and refused to return until something finished with it. The folder is thinner than it should be. The spacing of the staples and the faint pressure marks on the binding tell you there used to be more pages here. What survives is messy. Overlapping reports, medical notes, equipment logs, personal statements, anonymous marginalia. Enough to sketch the shape of something that should not have been possible, or at least not that easy to write off. Zone North was never a town, never a marked region on any human map. The name grew up inside the lab as a shorthand for a direction where things stopped lining up. Officially, the place existed to make nights visible. The cover name was long and dull. Something about low-light visual research. In practice, they tested equipment meant to see in the dark. Image intensifiers, experimental night vision scopes, new kinds of photometers that could register light too weak for the naked eye. Alongside the machines, they tested people. Soldiers, technicians, volunteers from nearby garrisons were marched into dark rooms and asked to describe what they could see as the lab slowly bled photons back into the air. It was methodical work in a setting that almost invited superstition. The first mentions of Zone North in the file are not in the equipment logs. They are in a stack of handwritten observer diaries, the kind nobody expects anyone to read carefully. Individuals assigned to night shifts were told to keep brief notes on anything that might affect their performance: sleep, headaches, strange dreams. The psychologists wanted baselines for stress. The engineers wanted to know when fatigue might be skewing results. One entry, dated only with a month and a year that place it late in the Cold War, reads, "Outside around 2 in the morning. Sky over the river is wrong. Like a winter afternoon, not night. Snow on the bank looks gray instead of black. No moon, no clouds, no aurora. When I stepped across the marker post, it snapped back to normal." Another, a few days later, from a different observer. Took a walk past the third mast. Right ahead, north, toward the ravine. The forest is visible in detail without lamp. I can see individual branches. Behind me, toward the building's normal darkness. When I call to Petrov, he says he sees nothing unusual, asks if I am pranking him. I make him walk forward. He stumbles exactly where the brightness starts, curses, says his eyes hurt. Petrov's name is redacted now. His curses survive. At first, nobody at the lab wanted to hear about it. These were people whose lives revolved around carefully controlled darkness. They knew how far you should be able to see on a moonless night, how fast your eyes adapted. brightness was not supposed to appear spontaneously beyond the fence, because one man took a few extra steps. The shift supervisor who read those entries underlined "winter afternoon" and scribbled in the margin, "Check for snow reflection from floodlights, nearby facility." There was no nearby facility. The floodlights at the compound were off that night, as they usually were to preserve experiments. It took 3 more similar reports, all describing the same general direction, before anyone wrote the phrase "Zone North," as if it were more than a joke. Zone North, in its earliest definition, was simply the area beyond the 3rd mast and past the bend in the river where, according to a subset of the staff, nights were not as dark as they should have been. It was not always bright. It came and went. On some nights, the world lay in its expected shades of black and deeper black. On others, there was an almost invisible layer of light stretched over the landscape in that one sector, like an extra skin. Not bright enough to call it day, one of the first witnesses wrote. More like a perfectly even dusk that someone forgot to switch off. The file is careful to distinguish between people who claimed to see this and those who did not. For some, Zone North was nothing more than a word other men used on cigarette breaks. They walked the same path, stood in the same clearing, and reported ordinary night. For others, the effect was unmistakable and unnerving. It was as if a second world with slightly different rules existed a few steps away, visible only from certain eyes. The first time the lab's machines noticed anything was an accident. In one of the low-light testing rooms, a researcher had left a photometer connected to an external sensor pointing roughly toward the river. The sensor was supposed to serve as a reference, measuring whatever ambient light leaked in from the night, so they could subtract it from their internal readings. On most graphs, it showed a flat, boring line hugging the bottom of the page. On the night one of the diaries first mentions being able to see individual branches over the ravine, that flat line wobbled and climbed. The climb was small in absolute terms, but stupidly precise. It rose to a value that, in the lab's calibration tables, corresponded to early evening illumination, a time of day when you can read a newspaper outside without strain. The trouble was that at the latitude of the lab, at that time of year, the sun had been down for hours. The moon was a pale, thin arc on the other side of the sky. Satellites of the right brightness had been accounted for. There was nothing in any official register that could have provided that much light. The researcher who saw the graph circled it and wrote, "Instrument drift? Check against second sensor." The second sensor, positioned at the opposite side of the compound and facing south, showed nothing beyond the usual noise of stars and distant settlements. Only the channel facing north recorded an impossible dusk. "Zone North?" someone scrawled in the margin in different ink. From there, the story stops being something you could plausibly attribute to one man's tired eyes. The lab's leadership did what they were supposed to do. They tried to turn a story into a map. Over a series of nights, they organized controlled walks. Selected observers, those who claimed to see the brightness and those who did not, were guided blindfolded to a starting point and then asked at prearranged intervals to open their eyes and report what they saw as they stepped forward toward the ravine. The transcripts are mundane until they are not. Step 1. Nothing unusual. Step 2. Nothing unusual. Step 3. Still dark. Step 4. Hold on. Yes. Trees become visible. I can see the far bank. from a non-seeing observer in the same sequence. Step 1, dark. Step 2, dark. Step 3, dark. Step 4, still dark. I hear him breathe in harder, like something happened, but I do not see it. After each run, the observers traded places without being told the results. Over and over, the same pattern emerged. For certain individuals, there was a line in space beyond which the night peeled back, and a soft, sourceless clarity settled over the landscape. For others, no such line existed. Some details repeated enough to be hard to ignore. Those who saw Zone North described the light as flat, directionless, like the sky is glowing instead of the ground. Shadows did not sharpen as they would under a lamp or moon. They dissolved. Faces looked oddly washed, as if colors had been shaved away, leaving only structure. It was not more colorful than daylight, but somehow less. They tried cameras next. If light in the ordinary sense was present, a film emulsion or an electronic sensor should have recorded it. The lab had both. Old, slow film cameras and newer experimental devices bolted together from foreign components and domestic improvisation. Films taken toward the ravine on bright nights, the ones the diaries mention, looked almost normal when developed. The trees were faintly outlined. Snow, when present, showed as a pale smear instead of total black. There was enough exposure to prove that something was there, more than starlight, but not enough to match what the seeing observers described. The electronic sensors were stranger. Image intensifiers that operated by amplifying existing light showed a kind of over-eagerness when aimed toward the zone. The output was grainy, yes, but portions of the image snapped into focus with less amplification than required in other directions. It was as if certain rods and cones in the picture wanted to be active. One technician remarked, in a note that probably sounded less foolish in his own head, "The tubes seemed to anticipate light there." None of this had yet attracted the attention of the KGB. As long as the oddities stayed within the walls of the lab and could plausibly be filed under instrument research, the committee's local officer was content to make the usual rounds, check the locks, remind people that secrets stayed on site. Zone North changed category the moment someone suggested using it. The suggestion appears in the file as a paragraph in a longer memo about military applications of night vision research. It is casual in tone, almost an afterthought. If the existence of a stable zone of increased nocturnal visibility can be confirmed and its boundaries characterized, the author writes, it may be possible to exploit such phenomena for night training, covert movement, or positioning of observation posts with an advantage over opponents. Further study should determine whether individuals can be selected or conditioned to perceive said zone more reliably. Selected, conditioned. The language of curiosity gives way to the language of control in less than a sentence. The committee's reaction is immediate. The local officer attaches his own note, forwarded up the chain. Reports of anomalous nocturnal illumination in northern sector have potential operational relevance, particularly regarding perception training and detection thresholds. Recommend formalization of investigation under separate designation to ensure proper oversight. That separate designation is Zone North. From that point, the file acquires the rhythm of a project, not just a collection of weird nights. They assemble a test group, personnel with above-average low-light acuity, according to their existing records. Some are lab staff. Others are soldiers from nearby units, handpicked by regimental doctors who owe favors. The participants are given standard medical exams, basic psychological screening, and a cover story that explains very little. Extended night adaptation study, potential for advancement, additional pay. Their work starts indoors. The lab has a dark room large enough to feel like a small theater. Walls and ceiling painted matte black, floor marked with faint lines and luminous paint. In this room, the investigators recreate as best they can the reported look of Zone North. Observers sit for half an hour under a hood that blocks stray light to let their eyes adjust. Then, using extremely dim projectors and filters, the researchers add a uniform glow to the room, raising the illumination in controlled steps while measuring the participants' ability to detect shapes. The ones who had already reported seeing Zone North outside consistently show a slightly different response curve. They detect changes sooner, at lower levels, but they also describe the lit room in similar terms. Flat, directionless, like the walls themselves are glowing. When asked which part of the room seems brightest, they often choose a point in the north wall, even though the lighting pattern is symmetrical. A psychologist writes, possible conditioning or expectation bias due to prior field experiences. An engineer underlines the same sentence and adds a question mark. The next phase moves back out into the actual landscape. With KGB oversight now formalized, the lab extends its monitoring network. More sensors are planted in the ground and on poles. Photometers, sky glow meters, even crude devices that convert changes in light into soft clicks for auditory monitoring. A separate small building, half buried and insulated, is equipped as an observation bunker facing the ravine, its roof barely breaking the surface of snow. On agreed nights when weather and moon phase are favorable, the test group is summoned. They emerge from the compound in small clusters, carrying no flashlights, following a rope line strung between markers to avoid missteps. Inside the bunker, instruments hum quietly, their needles ready to twitch. It is during one of these field sessions that the incident mentioned in the abstract, the fading signal recorded during a night that appeared unnaturally bright to a select group of observers, occurs. The transcript for that night is longer than most. It begins with routine checks. Wind speed, temperature, cloud cover, all ordinary. The river frozen solid, the forest a jagged black edge against the faint starlight. No moon, no aurora. Stars visible directly overhead, fading near the horizon in the usual way. Observers, 1 through 4, are seated at viewing slits in the bunker, facing north. Observers, 5 and 6, are posted outside, closer to the ravine, with radio headsets. The KGB officers in the back of the room, saying nothing, smoking too much. At first, everyone agrees it is just a dark night in the middle of nowhere. Then Observer 2, one of the early diary writers, comments quietly that the snow on the far bank is starting to lift. Nobody else sees it. A minute later, Observer 4, who on previous nights did not report Zone North, says, surprised, that he suddenly can make out the line of fallen trees by the river. Outside, Observers 5 and 6 pause mid-sentence as their own view changes. The instruments notice about 30 seconds after the people do. The main sky glow meter facing north shows a slow, smooth rise in registered illumination, as if someone had reached for a dimmer switch on a lamp the size of the horizon. The sensor facing south stays flat. Inside the bunker, the control panel's small indicator light for the north channel brightens almost imperceptibly. The log captures a flurry of overlapping observations. Observer 1. I can see the ravine. The snow is not black anymore. It looks gray, maybe darker than clouded day, but much brighter than earlier. Observer 3. I see nothing unusual. If anything, it feels darker. Observer 2. There's no direction to it. Like the whole air is lit, shadows are gone. Observer. Wait, now I see it. It's like someone wiped soot off the window. Then, a quieter voice from the back, the KGB officer, speaking for the only time that night. Describe the edge. Where does it start? The photometers agree, up to a point. Repositioned sensors show a gradient of increased light in the same general area, though the numbers never climb as high as the participants' descriptions would suggest. The instruments act as if the world has been turned from night to deep twilight. The observers act as if someone has flipped it from deep twilight to almost noon. In the middle of this, something odd happens in the bunker. The recording system, a set of the thermal printers, dragging thin paper under pen heads driven by the sensors, begins to produce what the log later calls a fading signal. The ink line representing the north-facing sky meter, which had climbed to a plateau of impossible brightness, starts to tremble. It develops a sawtooth pattern, not random, more like a stutter. Each stutter corresponds to a moment when several observers report a subjective flicker in the scene, a brief sense that the ravine is breathing, dimming and brightening, though the change is almost too fast to name. Then, without any change in the external conditions the meteorologist can detect, the line begins to descend. Observers describe it as if someone is slowly turning down the world's backlight. Trees losing detail, snow flattening, forest turning back into a silhouette. It is not dramatic, no switch is thrown. The ravine does not suddenly vanish. It is more like a fog rolling back in, except there is no fog, only darkness reasserting itself with quiet confidence. During this fade, the equipment in the bunker misbehaves in ways that are subtle on their own, but unnerving together. One of the auxiliary counters begins to tick in an irregular rhythm, as if responding to a stimulus no longer present. The bank of small indicator bulbs that show the status of various channels flickers in a slow wave, left to right, even though their circuits are independent. A backup photometer, not connected to the main system, records a brief spike in light just as the others start to drop. Most of that could be attributed to cheap hardware reacting to environmental shifts, if not for what comes next. Towards the end of the fade, as the North Channel approaches its original baseline, the data logging system, the part that stamps each line with its reading, produces a series of entries that do not match what the pens are drawing. The pen trace shows a steady, graceful descent. The digital register, printing numbers and short codes along the side for later indexing, shows the values holding steady at the peak for several seconds beyond that, refusing to acknowledge the drop. When the two finally realign, there is a step change in the printed record. The numbers abruptly decide that the light has been high all along and collapse back to normal without ever showing the descending slope the ink clearly drew. The technician responsible for the system circles that segment later and writes, with admirable restraint, logging unit and analog output disagree about what happened for approximately 20 to 30 seconds. Units share no timing hardware that could explain asynchrony of that magnitude. In plainer terms, for half a minute, part of the system insisted that the night had remained unnaturally bright, even as both the world and its own sensors said otherwise. That is the strange shift the abstract refers to. Not a power surge, not a glitch anyone could reproduce on command. A disagreement between two ways of describing the same thing, one more reluctant than the other to let Zone North go. The KGB's reaction to this is mixed. On one hand, their instincts tell them to back away from anything that makes reality look negotiable. On the other, here is a phenomenon that offers the ability to see farther than opponents in the dark, isolated in a patch of territory they already control, accessible to a select population who may or may not be trainable. They do what they always do. They try to turn it into a training program. A separate annex in the file is devoted to what they call Zone North Visual Acuity Conditioning. Participants who demonstrated sensitivity to the bright zone are kept on, given additional tasks and minor privileges. Those who did not are gradually rotated out, reassigned to more ordinary duties. No one is told why. They learn to guess. Conditioning takes familiar forms: extended dark adaptation sessions, repeated exposure to the zone under supervision, guided exercises where observers are asked to describe fine detail in distant objects just at the edge of the brightness. Some of them improve, others plateau. A few begin to see the zone even on nights when the instruments say nothing unusual is happening. From the psychologist's notes, 2 subjects report remembering the brighter ravine even when current conditions correspond to normal darkness. They describe residual outlines as if the zone were an afterimage. They are not able to agree on specific details, but they both insist there is more out there than ordinary night allows. One subject, identified only as N, begins to show discomfort indoors. He complains that the lab's dark room feels too empty at night, that his eyes reach for something that is not here. During daytime rests, he sits in the shade instead of sunlight, saying the direct glare feels coarse compared to what he experiences in Zone North. Medical checks show no physical damage to his eyes. Light sensitivity is slightly elevated, but within normal variance. His electroencephalograms during exposure sessions show patterns that no one quite knows how to interpret. They write phrases like heightened visual cortex activation and move on. The KGB's patience for ambiguous training results is not infinite. They want metrics. Can these people detect movement sooner? Can they navigate better under minimal light? Do they perform measurably better in simulated field conditions? The answers are mixed. In controlled tests, the zone-sensitive group does slightly better at certain tasks, but not by a margin that would justify building doctrine around them. The most significant differences arise not in performance, but in description. When asked to sketch the ravine as seen on a bright night, they include features no one else mentions. Faint, distant structures on the far ridge, glints that might be frozen streams or rocks, shadow shapes that suggest something like buildings, though no buildings exist there. Subject N and Subject L, independent sketches converge on suggestion of vertical forms beyond known tree line, one report notes. No corroborating topographical data. Possible cognitive artifacts. That phrase, cognitive artifacts, appears a lot. It is a comforting way of saying things we would rather not treat as external until we absolutely have to. The culminating incident that finally convinces the committee to treat Zone North as something to be shut down rather than cultivated comes late in the file and is missing enough pages that you can feel the gaps as much as you can read the lines. It is referred to in a heading that survived severed staples. Full night persistence event. Up until this point, Zone North had appeared and faded in episodes. An hour here, 2 hours there. The longest continuous period of anomalous brightness anyone recorded was around 3 hours, tapering off before dawn. During the full night event, according to the fragments we have, the zone did something different. It refused to end. It begins quietly on paper, like all the other nights. The log notes that the test group assembled in early evening. Weather clear, temperature well below freezing. No moon, stars visible, instruments nominal. Without timestamps, the narrative shifts. At approximately 2 hours after sunset, observers report initial onset of anomalous brightness in North Sector. Similar characteristics to previous events. Boundaries mapped. Equipment confirms increased illumination. So far, nothing new. Some observers outside the test group, including guards on the perimeter fence and staff in the canteen, also comment that the night seems less heavy. One cook goes outside for a smoke and comes back unsettled, saying she could see the label on a crate by the gate without stepping into the floodlight. But this time, the zone does not fade. The logs show repeated checks across the small hours. Each time, the North Channel's readings remain elevated, within a narrow band, as if locked. Observers, rotating through the bunker and outside positions, start to show signs of exhaustion not entirely attributable to the hour. Dry eyes, headaches, a sense of pressure behind the forehead. Those who do not see the zone report a different kind of discomfort. Confusion, disorientation, as if their internal maps of how night should look are no longer trustworthy. At some point after 3 in the morning, the lab director, who up to then has maintained the professional disbelief expected of him, writes a single line in a side note. This has gone on longer than any plausible meteorological curiosity. The KGB officer adds, in a separate hand, recommend preparing shutdown protocols in case of interference with regional systems. The shutdown protocols in question are not mystical. They involve something the lab has been experimenting with quietly, active light cancellation, as part of their work on protecting sensitive detectors from unwanted illumination. They have been playing with techniques that use tuned filters and opposing light sources to reduce net brightness in certain bands. The hope was to make instruments blind to specific sources of glare. Somebody suggests, half seriously, that they attempt to turn off Zone North the way one might dim a persistent glow on a screen, by throwing a carefully shaped darkness at it. It is a bad idea, in technical language. Still, by that hour, people are tired enough and alarmed enough to try. The director authorizes a limited test. Specialized lamps in the bunker, designed to emit narrow band lights slightly out of phase with certain frequencies, are pointed north through filters. They are not strong devices, and in normal conditions their effect on the sky would be negligible. But Zone North is not normal conditions. The instrument logs for the next sequence remain partially intact. They show the elevated North Channel, holding steady, then briefly rising even higher as the cancellation array powers up, as if the zone pushes back when challenged. Seconds later, there is a sharp drop, too steep to be natural. It overshoots the original baseline, registering values lower than typical for a clear, starry night. For a few moments, according to the sensors, the ravine is darker than dark. Observers, both those who see the zone and those who do not, experience that moment subjectively. Those outside report falling forward, a sudden sense that the ground has been scooped out from under them, even though they do not actually move. Several stumble. One vomits. In the bunker, the viewing slits show nothing at all. Not trees, not snow, not the faint cloud of breath when someone exclaims. It is as if someone has painted over the world with the deepest shade of black and left no edges. Then, just as fast, the readings climb again. Only this time they do not stop at the previous plateau. The north channel saturates. The analog outputs slam into their upper limits and stay there, pens pressed uselessly against the top of their scales. The digital logger, which had previously hesitated to record the descent, now decides that the whole range of possible values is too narrow and begins to wrap around, printing nonsense codes interspersed with the highest numbers it knows. Witnesses say that the ravine becomes painfully bright to them, not in the way of sunlight, which casts harsh shadows and makes you squint, but in a way that makes it impossible to judge distance. The world out there becomes a white cutout, a layered silhouette of trees and ground and sky with no shading. Some describe it as seeing the bones of the landscape. Those who were blind to Zone North before now see something, whether they want to or not. It is too much for some. A guard on the fence line, never previously sensitive, collapses and claws at his face, saying he cannot close his eyes far enough. Inside the bunker, the light-sensing equipment, designed to be delicate, does what delicate things do under stress. It dies. Fuses blow, amplifiers burn. One of the photometer housings emits a sharp, single crack like a small bone breaking. The cancellation lamps, after their brief attempt at erasing the zone, overload and darken permanently. In the middle of all this, the KGB officer does the one thing he is explicitly permitted to do in emergencies. He picks up the secure phone line and orders a regional power cut. The idea is superstitious and technical at once. If Zone North is somehow entangled with the grid, with the hum of current in wires and transformers, perhaps killing that hum will let night reclaim its place. It is not a plan the Energy Ministry will thank him for, but his clearance outranks their comfort. Somewhere beyond the lab, switches are thrown. Substations open. Towns and bases across the region drop into sudden, bewildered dark. Households reach for candles and mutter to themselves. Pilots in the air frown at dead runway lights. Generators cough into life where they can. Around the lab, nothing noticeable happens for several long, shaky minutes. Zone North, as perceived by those in it, remains an overexposed diagram of the world. The sky is a uniform blank. The forest is a cutout. The ravine is a white wound in the ground. The instruments, those that have not burned, still register saturation. Then, gradually, the saturation breaks. This time, there is no smooth fade. There is a series of steps, as if someone were descending a staircase in the dark, not entirely sure where the next tread is. The brightness drops a little, stabilizes, drops again. Each drop is accompanied by a wave of reactions from the observers. Gasps, headaches easing, legs regaining their sense of weight. The last step is the one the file tries hardest to smooth over. The analog traces, on the few machines still functioning, show the north channel falling past its normal baseline again and settling just below it. The digital logger, after its burst of nonsense, suddenly starts printing correct numbers again. But these numbers describe a night that is slightly darker than usual. Observers confirm that the ravine has returned to something like real darkness. The trees are a wall again. The snow is a dull, nearly invisible smear. Stars near the horizon are faint but present. It is over, except not quite. From that point onward, on all subsequent nights the lab monitored, the north-facing instruments consistently recorded levels of ambient light very slightly below expected values. Not much, just enough that, plotted over weeks, the line sits lower than the South Channel's equivalent. The world in that direction, according to the machines, remained a fraction darker than it had been before Zone North first appeared. Some observers noticed it without numbers. A few said the ravine felt emptier, as if something had been scooped out of it. Subject N complained that ordinary nights now looked like someone turned the contrast down too far. He reported difficulty reading distant shapes even under normal dusk, as if whatever faculty had allowed him to see Zone North had been bent and dulled. The KGB officer's internal assessment after the full-night event is short and unwelcome. The phrase strategic risk is underlined twice in a different pen. That is how you get a project shut down. The official orders that follow are framed as consolidation and refocusing. The lab is instructed to terminate exploratory work on anomalous illumination phenomena and redirect resources to conventional low-light equipment development. The testing bunker is to be decommissioned. The external sensors are to be removed. All records relating specifically to Zone North are to be separated from the main archive and placed under Central Committee custody. You can see the handover in the paper trail. Rubber stamps change. Report headers lose the zone designation. Progress summaries begin to talk only of lenses and tubes and export versions of devices already tested elsewhere. What you cannot see, unless you pay attention to absences, is the second layer of cleanup. Several original diaries are missing, their absence disguised by tidy renumbering. Early data reels referenced in the equipment logs are marked unreadable, in a handwriting that looks suspiciously practiced. Cross-references to external complaints, villagers writing to local officials about the strange, bright night that unsettled livestock and children, are cut away, leaving only ragged impressions where the paper used to be. One particularly clumsy edit sits visible in a psychological summary. The original sentence, still faintly legible under corrective fluid, reads, "Some subjects express the belief that Zone North represents a permanent alteration of the local environment, not a transient event." On top of it, the retyped version. Some subjects display anxiety and catastrophic thinking relating to nighttime conditions. The word belief disappears. The world is put back in its place with a smear of white. Not everything is so easy to censor. Buried near the end of the folder, after the official closure, after the last stamped directive, there are a few small documents that someone must have slipped back in after the fact. They are undated, unsigned, written in ballpoint pen on cheap-lined paper. One is a brief note from a regional meteorological station, not part of the original project, reporting unusual reports of persistent twilight-like conditions on a particular night, the same night as the full-night event, over a narrow corridor centered on the lab's latitude. The station's instruments did not detect any obvious anomaly. The staff chalked it up to human impression biased by snow cover. But one technician was bothered enough to send a copy to a colleague he knew in the north. Another is a line from a power grid report, mentioning a rare, widespread nighttime load drop triggered by external order, and noting that Several local transformers experienced minor anomalies upon restoration of power, including phase imbalances and unexplained minor arcing. The third is the most quietly unsettling. It appears to be a fragment of a personal letter from one lab worker to a relative in a far-off city, intercepted and copied before the original was presumably destroyed. In it, the writer mentions work only obliquely. Most of the letter is about the cold, about the strange silence of the forest in winter, about the boredom of nights. Then there is this, translated. We had a night here that did not behave itself. Everyone pretends now that it was just an odd glow, an electrical thing. But I know what I saw. It was like someone lifted the world into a different room and forgot to close the door. Since then, ordinary nights feel wrong, like they are missing a layer. Sometimes, when I wake up, I have the sensation that the ceiling above me is brighter than it should be, as if something is still shining through from the other side, but only when my eyes are half closed. There is no answer to that letter in the file. Only a stamp, information incorporated, original retained for training purposes. Training in what exactly is not specified. The last mark, the one that finally closed the cover on Zone North, is not an order at all. It is a question, written in pencil on the inside of the back panel by someone who had read more of the papers than they were supposed to. We built machines to pull light up out of almost nothing, it says. We teach eyes to see more than they should. What if, one night, the world noticed the attention and answered by thinning the darkness for a while? And when we panicked and tried to push it back, maybe it took a little more with it than we intended. Below that, in the same hand, a smaller line. The maps say night returned to normal. The instruments say it settled lower. The people who were there say it never quite came back. You can treat that as poetic exaggeration. You probably should. Zone North is not on any chart now. The lab is likely abandoned or repurposed. Its bunker filled, its sensors sold for scrap. The ravine by the river is just another curve in a landscape most people will never see. On satellite photographs, it looks like any other patch of frozen earth. At that latitude, in certain seasons, the nights are brief and the days are long. The land knows how to blur the border between light and dark without anyone's help, and yet the file exists, and so does the residue in the numbers. A faint, stubborn offset in measurements no one bothered to scrub retroactively. The kind of thing you only notice if you compare baselines across decades, and wonder why, for a few years, one direction on one forgotten lab's horizon always reads a fraction dimmer than the models say it should. Maybe that is nothing more than bad calibration. A tired technician twiddling the wrong knob. Or maybe it is what is left when you ask the night too many questions about how dark it really is, and then slam the door in its face when the answer goes further than you wanted. The Soviet night that refused to turn dark lasted, officially, a handful of hours and left, officially, no lasting mark. Unofficially, it lingers here, in graphite and fading ink, in testimonies that tilt away from explanation, in instruments that briefly argued with themselves about how much light there was. It is easy to put the folder back on the shelf and walk away under the ordinary ceiling lights of this building, trusting that the sky outside behaves itself. It is harder, after reading it, to stand in a quiet place on a clear winter night, look north, and shake the feeling that somewhere, once, a section of darkness learned it could thin out and make itself useful, and that the only reason it stopped was because the people watching it got scared enough to pull the plug on their own curiosity.